The crystal flutes didn't just fall, they shattered with a violent musical percussion that echoed off the cathedral's vaulted marble ceilings. Shards of glass danced across the polished floor, catching the light of 1,000 flickering candles. In an instant, the air in the room sucked out. The priest froze, his mouth hung open mid-blessing. The string quartet sawed to a jagged halt. 500 of the city's most powerful people turned in their pews, their collective gaze landing on a woman in a cheap polyester vest. Maya stood in the center of the aisle, her hands still outspread as if holding a ghost. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her eyes were locked on the man at the altar. Dominic Thorne didn't look like a dead man. He looked like a god. His tuxedo was hand-stitched, his hair perfectly swept back, and his jawline was as sharp as the glass at Maya's feet. But as he turned to see the source of the commotion, the color drained from his tanned face. For a fleeting second, the real estate king vanished, and the boy she had once loved, the boy who had promised to build her a castle before faking his own death, stared back at her with pure, unadulterated terror. "Maya?" His voice was a whisper, but in the sudden, suffocating silence of the church, it carried like a shout. The bride, a senator's daughter draped in lace that cost more than Maya's annual rent, looked between them, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Dominic? Who is this person? Security, get her out of here." Two massive men in dark suits stepped from the shadows of the pillars, their hands moving toward their waistbands. This was the moment Maya's life should have ended, or at least, the moment she should have been dragged into an alley and silenced. Her knees felt like water. Every instinct she had, honed by years of hiding and surviving on tips, told her to run, to apologize, to scrub the floor and disappear. But then she thought of her son, Leo, sitting in a cramped apartment with a nebulizer, breathing through lungs that shouldn't have been struggling. She thought of the 5 years she spent grieving a man who was busy building a criminal empire under a new name. "The I do is a lie," Maya said. Her voice started small, then grew, ringing out with a clarity that surprised even her. She took a step forward, her sensible work shoes crunching on the broken crystal. "You can't marry him, Elena, because Dominic Thorne died in a car fire 5 years ago. Or at least, that's what the police report he filed in Chicago says." A gasp rippled through the pews. The senator stood up, his face reddening. Dominic stepped off the altar, his eyes darkening, the predatory mask of the mafia boss sliding back into place. "She's a disgruntled employee," Dominic said, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "She's clearly unstable. Take her out, now." The guards lunged, but Maya didn't flinch. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a worn laminated photograph and a stack of medical bills. She held them up high, her hand shaking but her spirit steady. "I'm not unstable, Dominic. I'm the mother of the son you left behind," she shouted, her voice echoing off the stained glass. "And I'm the woman who has the original ledger you thought burned in that car. You didn't just leave me. You left your paper trail." The entire room went breathless. The speechless moment didn't come from the crash of the glass, but from the look of absolute ruin on Dominic's face as Maya marched toward the altar, no longer a waitress, but his judge and jury. The wedding of the century had just become the crime of the decade. The alarm clock didn't beep. It rattled against the nightstand at 4:30 a.m., a harsh, metallic sound that felt like a punch to the gut. Maya reached out, her fingers fumbling in the dark until she silenced it. For a moment she lay still in the cold gray light of the basement apartment, listening to the rhythmic, heavy wheezing coming from the small bed across the room. That sound was the metronome of her life. It was the sound of her 5-year-old son, Leo, struggling for every breath. And it was the reason she got out of bed when her muscles screamed for another hour of sleep. She stood up, her feet hitting the cracked linoleum floor, and walked over to him. Leo looked so small under the faded blue blankets, his chest rising and falling with an effort no child should have to know. She adjusted his nebulizer mask, her touch feather-light. Every puff of medicine, every doctor's visit, and every specialized inhaler was a line item in a budget that never quite balanced. To the world, Maya was a ghost, a woman in a black and white uniform who moved through crowded rooms without leaving a trace. But to Leo, she was everything. And for Leo, she would work until her bones turned to dust. The grind of being a high-end banquet waitress was a specific kind of soul-crushing labor. It wasn't just the physical toll of carrying heavy silver trays or standing for 12 hours on feet that felt like they were blistering inside her shoes. It was the invisibility. She spent her nights serving people who looked right through her, people who spent more on a single bottle of vintage champagne than she made in 3 months. She had learned to keep her head down, to anticipate a guest's need before they even spoke, and to blend into the wallpaper so perfectly that she became part of the furniture. "I'll be back before you wake up for your morning meds, Bug," she whispered, kissing Leo's cool forehead. Her mother, who lived 2 doors down, would be over in 20 minutes to take over the watch. Maya pulled on her crisp white shirt, tucking it into her black slacks with practiced precision. She tied her hair back into a tight, professional bun, wiping away a smudge of weariness from under her eyes. Today was the big one, the Thorne-Hamilton wedding. It was the kind of assignment the agency only gave to their most reliable, most invisible workers. The tips alone could cover Leo's next 3 treatments, maybe even buy him that sturdy winter coat he desperately needed. As she hopped on the early bus, the city was still waking up, shrouded in a low, damp mist. Maya leaned her head against the cold window, watching the blur of streetlights. She didn't dream of riches or romance anymore. Those dreams had died 5 years ago in a wreckage of lies and broken promises. Now, her only goal was survival. She just needed to get through this shift, keep her tray steady, and collect her check. She had no idea that by the time the sun set, the invisibility she had cultivated like a shield would become her greatest weapon, and the man who had turned her into a ghost was about to see her in terrifying, vivid color. The side entrance of the cathedral was a beehive of frantic energy. Florists were hauling in towering arrangements of white orchids, and the lead coordinator was snapping her fingers at the catering staff, her voice a sharp hiss in the hallowed space. Maya fell into line automatically. She grabbed a silver tray, adjusted her white gloves, and began her silent dance through the pews. Her job was simple: ensure the VIP section had sparkling water and that the groom's family wanted for nothing before the procession began. The air inside the church was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and beeswax. Maya kept her chin tucked, her eyes focused on the polished toes of the guests' shoes. This was her armor, being nobody, seeing nothing. She moved toward the front of the sanctuary, where the light from the massive stained glass windows spilled across the altar in pools of ruby and sapphire. Then, the organ music swelled, a deep, vibrating chord that shook the very floorboards. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung open, and the congregation rose as one. Maya stepped back into the shadows of a massive stone pillar, waiting for the wedding party to take their places so she could retreat to the kitchens. The groom was already standing at the altar, his back to the crowd. He looked tall and commanding, his shoulders broad under the black silk of his tuxedo. Maya found herself staring at the back of his head, at a small, familiar cowlick near the crown of his dark hair. A cold shiver, sharp as a needle, traced its way down her spine. She told herself it was just the draft from the ancient stone walls. She told herself she was tired, that the 4 a.m. wake-up call was playing tricks on her mind. The groom turned slowly to watch his bride glide down the aisle. The silver tray in Maya's hands tipped dangerously. The man standing at the altar wasn't just a stranger with a familiar silhouette. He was the ghost that haunted her every night. He was the man she had cried over until her tear ducts ran dry. He was Dominic. He looked older, more refined, his face hardened by a power she didn't recognize, but it was him. The way he tilted his head, or the specific curve of his mouth. It was the same face that had looked at her with whispered promises of forever in a cramped Chicago diner 5 years ago. The same face she had seen in the grainy newspaper photo of a charred car wreck that supposedly took his life. Maya felt the world tilt. The sounds of the wedding march became a dull roar in her ears like a rushing river. Her breath hitched, catching in a throat that had suddenly gone bone dry. She wanted to scream, to run, to fall to her knees. This man was standing in a house of God, pledging his life to a senator's daughter, while Maya was counting pennies for their son's medicine. Dominic's gaze swept across the front rows, a confident, practiced smile on his lips. Then his eyes drifted toward the shadows of the pillar. For a heartbeat, his smile didn't just fade, it vanished. His eyes widened, the pupils shrinking into pinpricks of pure shock. He looked at Maya, standing there in her cheap waitress vest, and for the first time in 5 years, the dead man looked like he had seen a ghost of his own. The resurrection was complete, and the lie that had built his new empire began to crack right before Maya's eyes. The flickering candlelight of the cathedral blurred, and suddenly Maya wasn't standing in a drafty stone church. She was back in a tiny, grease-stained diner in South Chicago. It was 5 years ago, and the air smelled of cheap coffee and the rain-drenched pavement outside. Dominic had been sitting across from her in a booth with cracked red vinyl, his hands wrapped around a mug to keep warm. Back then, he didn't wear silk ties or custom-tailored wool. He wore a faded leather jacket and a smile that made Maya feel like the only girl in a city of millions. She had loved him because he was the only person who truly saw her. They were both scrappers, kids from the neighborhood who dreamed of something bigger than a paycheck-to-paycheck existence. Dominic was ambitious, always talking about the big play that would get them out of the shadows. He promised her a house with a yard and a life where she'd never have to count her tips twice just to afford a gallon of milk. When she told him she was pregnant, he hadn't flinched. He had kissed her forehead and sworn that their son would never know the cold. But as the weeks passed, the light in Dominic's eyes began to change. He started coming home late, his clothes smelling of expensive cigars and ozone. He stopped talking about the big play and started talking about debts and family obligations to men whose names were only whispered in the back of bars. Maya didn't know then that he was being courted by the Valenti crime syndicate. To them, Dominic was the perfect soldier, smart, desperate, and remarkably invisible. The betrayal didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a kiss. On a Tuesday night, Dominic held her closer than usual. He told her he had to go away for a few days to settle a deal that would change everything. He looked at her with a desperate, haunted intensity, as if he were trying to memorize every line of her face. "I'm doing this for us, Maya," he had whispered. "Everything I do is for you and the baby." The next morning, the news was on every channel. A car had swerved off the expressway and slammed into a concrete pillar before erupting into a fireball. The police found a wallet with Dominic's ID and a charred watch she had given him for his birthday. There was no body to bury, only a closed casket and a mountain of debt he had secretly accumulated in her name. Maya had spent months in a fog of grief, nearly losing the baby as she worked 3 jobs to pay off the collectors who came knocking at her door. It was only later, when a stranger left an anonymous envelope at her door containing a few $1,000s and a note that simply said, "Forget him," that she realized the truth. Dominic hadn't died. He had used the fire to cremate his old life, including her, so he could rise through the ranks of the mafia without the burden of a waitress and a sickly child holding him back. He had traded his soul for a seat at the table of the elite, and he had used Maya's broken heart as the stepping stone. Standing there in the cathedral, watching him adjust his cufflinks at the altar, Maya realized the man she loved had truly died in that fire. The man in front of her was a monster in a tuxedo, and he was about to find out that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy a boss can have. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the pipe organ felt like a physical weight pressing against Maya's chest as the senator began his slow march down the aisle. Senator Hamilton was a man whose face was plastered on every billboard in the city, the people's champion, a pillar of law and order. He walked with a practiced, regal gait, his chin held high, while his daughter, Clara, clung to his arm like a delicate silk ribbon. She was beautiful, innocent, and completely oblivious to the shark she was about to marry. Maya watched from the shadows of the stone pillar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She looked at the senator's face as he approached the altar. He didn't look like a father losing a daughter. He looked like a CEO closing the deal of a lifetime. There was a brief, knowing nod exchanged between the senator and Dominic, a silent communication that bypassed the holy vows they were about to recite. In that look, Maya saw the truth. This wasn't a union of love. It was a merger. The senator wasn't just giving away his daughter, he was giving Dominic a shield. By marrying into the Hamilton family, the man who had faked his death to lead a crime syndicate was buying a permanent pass from the law. With a senator as a father-in-law, Dominic's real estate business would be untouchable. The police would look the other way, the tax audits would vanish, and the blood on Dominic's hands would be washed clean by political influence. Maya looked down at her own hands, chapped and red from caustic cleaning supplies and the endless cycle of washing dishes. She thought of the senator's campaign speeches about protecting the hard-working families of this city. It was all a lie. While she sat in a drafty apartment praying that Leo's nebulizer wouldn't lose power during a storm, the man who claimed to represent her was shaking hands with the devil who had abandoned her. The senator reached the altar and took Clara's hand, placing it firmly into Dominic's. The gesture was supposed to be a symbol of trust, but to Maya it looked like a handoff of stolen goods. Dominic smiled, that same charming, crooked smile he had used on Maya 5 years ago, and leaned in to whisper something to the senator. They shared a quiet, private laugh while the priest cleared his throat to begin the ceremony. A cold, hard clarity settled over Maya. If she stayed silent, the cycle would be complete. Dominic would become a pillar of society, built on the bones of the life he had burned. The senator would get his campaign funding, Clara would get her fairy tale, and Maya would go back to her basement, a ghost serving the gods of the city. She looked at the exit sign over the heavy oak doors. She could leave. She could walk out right now, take her meager paycheck, and pretend she never saw him. She could protect Leo by staying invisible. But as the priest began to speak about the sanctity of truth and the gravity of the covenant, Maya realized that her silence wasn't protection. It was permission. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard plastic of her phone and the folded, tattered medical bills. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only person in this room of 500 elites who knew exactly what kind of monster was standing under the crucifix. The fear that had kept her small for 5 years began to evaporate, replaced by a white-hot sense of purpose. She didn't just want her life back. She wanted to tear down the altar they were building on her silence. The priest's voice droned on, a rhythmic hum about devotion and the joining of two souls, but Maya didn't hear a word of it. Her world had narrowed down to a single path, the long crimson carpet that stretched toward the man who had left her for dead. She stepped out from behind the stone pillar, her movements fluid and deliberate. She wasn't running, and she wasn't hiding. For the first time in 5 years, Maya was walking with her head held high. As she moved into the center aisle, the side-eye glances from the guests began. A few socialites wrinkled their noses at her polyester uniform, assuming she was just a confused server looking for a dropped tray. But as she passed the midpoint of the cathedral, the 2 guards at the foot of the altar realized she wasn't stopping. They shifted, their hands dropping to their sides, their bodies tensing like wolves guarding a den. Maya didn't look at them. She kept her eyes locked on the back of Dominic's head. She reached the first guard, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckle who stepped directly into her path. He reached out a massive hand to grab her shoulder, his mouth opening to deliver a quiet, brutal threat. "Don't," Maya said. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud. It was a low, vibrating command that carried a weight of authority the guard clearly didn't expect from a waitress. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sheer coldness in her eyes. Maya didn't give him a second chance. She sidestepped him with a grace born of years navigating crowded dining rooms and kept moving. By the time she reached the second guard, the music had begun to falter. The organist, sensing the shift in the room's energy, let a chord trail off into a haunting, unfinished note. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Every head in the cathedral turned. Dominic stiffened. He didn't turn around immediately, but his shoulders hiked up toward his ears. He knew that voice. He knew that footfall. Maya stepped onto the first marble riser of the altar, placing herself just feet away from the bride and groom. "The ceremony is over," Maya said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the vast hollow space of the church like a blade. Clara, the bride, gasped, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat. The senator took a step forward, his face twisting into a mask of polite fury. "What is the meaning of this? Someone get this woman out of here." But Maya didn't move. She stood her ground as the guards finally swarmed up the steps behind her. She didn't struggle when they grabbed her arms. She just looked at Dominic, who was finally forced to turn and face her. Up close, the terror in his eyes was even more satisfying. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "You told me you were doing this for us, Dominic," she whispered, loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear. The "us" hung in the air, a poisonous cloud over the pristine white flowers of the altar. "But you weren't. You were just looking for a bigger cage to hide in." The senator's guards hesitated, their grip on her arms loosening as they looked at Dominic's pale, trembling face for direction. He couldn't give it. The powerful mafia boss, the man who had bought the city, was suddenly small. The music had stopped, the guests were frozen, and the only sound left in the cathedral was the steady, fearless breathing of the woman they all thought was invisible. The silence in the cathedral was no longer respectful. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. The guards still had their hands on Maya's arms, but they weren't pulling her away. They were waiting for a signal from Dominic that wouldn't come. He stood frozen, his eyes darting toward the side exits, looking for a way to escape a ghost that had finally cornered him. Maya reached into the deep pocket of her serving apron. The senator's daughter began to sob, a quiet, shaky sound that seemed to break the spell of the room. "Dominic, tell her she's crazy," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking. "Tell everyone this is a mistake." Dominic opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He looked at Maya with a silent plea, a look that begged her to name her price, to take whatever money he had and disappear back into the shadows. But Maya wasn't there to negotiate. She pulled out a slim, battered digital tablet she had borrowed from a neighbor and held it up for the front rows to see. Her fingers, stained from years of hard labor, tapped the screen with a steady, clinical precision. 5 years ago, a man was buried in a cemetery on the south side, Maya said, her voice projecting to the very back of the hall. The city was told he died in a tragic accident. The police closed the file. The insurance company paid out to anonymous offshore accounts. Everyone moved on. She turned the screen toward the senator. On the display was a grainy, high-definition video feed from a security camera. It wasn't from the night of the fire. It was from the funeral. The footage showed the mourners standing around an empty casket, but then the camera panned to a black car parked 300 yards away in the trees. The zoom was sharp, and there, leaning against the door with a cigarette in his hand, was Dominic. He was watching his own burial, a cold smile on his face as he checked a gold watch. The same watch Maya had saved for 6 months to buy him. A collective gasp swept through the pews. It wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was a haunting. Maya swiped the screen again. This time, it showed a side-by-side comparison of 2 sets of fingerprints. One set was from a decade-old arrest record for a street-level hustler named Dominic Thorne. The other set was pulled from a wine glass at a high-stakes charity gala held just last month for the city's newest real estate mogul. The match was highlighted in a bright, undeniable red. "You didn't just leave a girl and a baby?" Maya said, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive cologne on his skin. "You committed federal fraud. You stole a new identity and built this entire life on a foundation of ash. And you did it while your son was gasping for air in a basement apartment you couldn't be bothered to remember." The senator stepped forward, his face no longer red with anger, but white with the realization of what this meant for his career. He looked at the tablet, then at the video of the man he was about to make his son-in-law. The corruption was too deep, the proof too public. The guests were already holding up their phones, recording every second. The story was hitting the internet before Maya could even finish her sentence. Dominic reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grab the tablet, but the guards, men who followed power, not loyalty, finally stepped back. They let go of Maya and moved away from him as if he were suddenly radioactive. The mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who had run out of lies, standing under the bright, judgmental lights of the cathedral, completely and utterly speechless. The polished veneer of the real estate king shattered like the crystal flutes Maya had dropped minutes before. For a few seconds, Dominic stood paralyzed, the digital proof of his ghost life glowing in the dim light of the cathedral. But as the murmurs from the pews grew into a roar of judgment, the fear in his eyes turned into something much uglier. The sophisticated businessman vanished, replaced by the desperate street soldier he had always been at his core. Dominic lunged forward, his face contorted in a snarl. He didn't care about the cameras or the hundreds of witnesses anymore. He grabbed Maya by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength that made her wince. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed, his voice no longer a smooth baritone but a jagged, terrifying rasp. "You're a waitress, Maya. You're a nobody from a basement. I own this city. I own the people who make people like you disappear. You give me that tablet and you walk out of here right now, or I swear to God, you won't make it to the end of the block." The threat was loud enough for the first few rows to hear, and for a heartbeat, a cold dread settled over the room. This was the man the rumors spoke of. The man who didn't negotiate, he only destroyed. But Dominic had forgotten one thing. He wasn't in a dark alley anymore. He was standing in the middle of a political coronation, and his partner in crime was a man who valued his own reputation above everything else. Senator Hamilton stepped between them, his heavy hand landing on Dominic's chest and shoving him back. The senator's face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't acting out of a sense of justice. He was a shark who realized he had just been fed a poisoned bait. "Get your hands off her," the senator barked. His voice, trained for stump speeches and debates, filled the cathedral with a power that drowned out Dominic's desperation. Dominic spun toward his father-in-law, his eyes wide. "Arthur, listen to me. She's lying. She's a plant. Someone sent to tank the campaign." "I saw the video, Dominic," the senator interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt. "I saw the fingerprints. You didn't just lie to me about your past. You brought federal heat into my family. You made me a partner to a dead man walking." He turned to his own security detail, men who were paid by the state, not the syndicate. "Secure him. Now. And call the commissioner. Tell him we have a person of interest in the Thorne fraud case." Dominic's jaw dropped. The betrayal he had once dealt to Maya was now being served back to him on a silver platter. He looked at the guards who were now closing in on him, then back at the senator, and finally at Clara, who was being led away in tears. The empire he had built on the ashes of his old life was collapsing in real time. "You can't do this!" Dominic screamed, his voice cracking as he was forced to his knees on the marble steps. "I have records, Arthur. If I go down, I'm taking your whole office with me." The senator didn't even flinch. And he just looked at Maya, a brief flicker of recognition passing between them. He saw a woman who had just burned down the world's most powerful man with a 10-year-old tablet. He leaned in close to Dominic, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "You don't have records, Dominic. You have a waitress's word against a senator's power, and in this room, you're already a ghost again." Maya watched as they pinned Dominic's arms behind his back. He was screaming now, a raw, primal sound of a man losing everything, but the music of the cathedral had been replaced by the sirens wailing in the distance. She stood tall, her heart finally slowing down, watching the man she once loved turn into the small, broken criminal he had always been beneath the silk suit. The cathedral had transformed from a place of worship into a scene of absolute chaos. The heavy oak doors burst open, but it wasn't more guests arriving. It was a team of federal agents in dark windbreakers, their boots thudding rhythmically against the stone floor. The sirens outside had grown into a deafening chorus, their blue and red lights strobing through the stained glass windows and splashing jagged colors across the panicked faces of the elite. Dominic struggled against the senator's guards, his face purple with rage, but the arrival of the feds took the air out of his lungs. He went limp for a second, realizing that the senator hadn't just turned on him, he had likely been the one to give the final signal to the agents waiting in the wings. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Dominic's wrists, the mafia boss looked less like a king and more like a cornered animal. "Make way! Move back!" the agents shouted, clearing a path through the throng of socialites and politicians. Dominic was led down the aisle he had walked so confidently only an hour before. As he passed Maya, he tried to lung toward her one last time, a curse dying on his lips, but the agents surged forward, hauling him toward the exit. The guests, who Maya had spent the morning fearing, didn't shrink away from her. Instead, they moved like a human shield. A woman in a silk gown, someone Maya had served appetizers to just hours earlier, stepped in front of her, blocking Dominic's hateful glare. A group of businessmen who usually treated service staff like furniture formed a tight circle around her, their backs to the chaos. They weren't just curious. They were witnessing a miracle. They had seen a woman with nothing take down a man who thought he owned everything. "Are you all right, dear?" an elderly woman whispered, reaching out to steady Maya's shaking hand. Maya couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the open doors where the sunlight was pouring in. She watched as Dominic was shoved into the back of a black SUV. The door slammed shut, cutting off his frantic shouting, and the vehicle sped away, disappearing into the city traffic. The shadow that had hung over her life for 5 years was suddenly, violently gone. The senator's daughter was gone, whisked away through a side door, and the senator himself was busy huddled with his lawyers, already crafting the narrative that would cast him as a victim of Dominic's deception. No one was looking at Maya anymore with disdain. The invisible girl was the center of the room, but for the first time, she didn't want to hide. And she felt the weight of the tablet in her pocket, the evidence that had set her free. One of the catering managers approached her, his face pale. He looked at her uniform, then at her face, and simply nodded toward the back exit. He didn't ask her to clean up the broken glass. He didn't ask her to get back to work. He understood that her shift was over, not just for the day, but for that version of her life. Maya walked out of the cathedral and into the crisp afternoon air. The sidewalk was crowded with reporters and onlookers, but she slipped through them, unnoticed in the shuffle. She didn't look back at the grand spires or the wealthy crowd. She started walking toward the bus stop, her heart light and her mind racing. She had a phone call to make to her mother. She had to tell her that Leo didn't have to live in a basement anymore. And the escape wasn't just about leaving the church. It was about leaving the fear behind. The morning sun didn't struggle to reach Maya anymore. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her storefront, warming the polished wood counters and the smell of fresh flour and roasted beans. 6 months had passed since the day the glass shattered in the cathedral, and sometimes Maya still woke up expecting to hear the rattle of that old, metallic alarm clock in a damp basement. Instead, she woke up to the sound of a quiet, steady breath that didn't rattle at all. Leo was sitting at a small table in the corner of the bakery, swinging his legs as he colored a picture of a superhero. His cheeks were round and pink, glowing with a health that a year ago had seemed like a distant, impossible prayer. Thanks to the settlement from Dominic's seized assets, a legal battle the senator had fast-tracked just to keep his own name out of the headlines, Leo had received the best specialists in the country. He wasn't a medical case anymore. He was just a 5-year-old boy who liked to run until he was out of breath simply because he could. Maya smoothed her apron. It wasn't the thin, itchy polyester of a catering uniform. It was heavy, dark denim with the name of her shop, Maya's Table, embroidered over the heart. She wasn't a ghost in someone else's mansion anymore. She was the owner, the boss, and the heart of a neighborhood hub. People didn't look through her here. They looked at her with smiles, calling her by name as they came in for their morning coffee. The news on the small television mounted behind the counter occasionally flashed images of the ongoing trial. Dominic Thorne, now referred to by his birth name again, looked gaunt and gray in his orange jumpsuit. The mafia boss had been stripped of his silk suits and his stolen power, facing a litany of charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life behind bars. Maya didn't feel a surge of hate when she saw him. She felt a strange, quiet pity, and then she felt nothing at all. He was a part of a story she had finished reading. A customer walked in, the bell over the door chiming a bright, cheerful note. It was a woman she recognized from the wedding, one of the guests who had stood in that protective circle around her. She didn't mention the cathedral, and neither did Maya. And they just talked about the crumb of the sourdough and the weather. That was the greatest luxury of Maya's new life, the ability to be ordinary. As the afternoon rush slowed, Maya walked over to Leo and sat down beside him. He looked up, his eyes bright and clear, and handed her a crayon. "Look, Mommy, I drew the sun," he said, pointing to a vibrant yellow circle that took up half the page. Maya hugged him, breathing in the scent of childhood and safety. She thought about the waitress's vest hanging in the back of her closet, kept only as a reminder of how far she had climbed. She would never have to wear it again. She had traded her silence for a voice, her fear for a future, and her invisibility for a life where she was finally, beautifully seen. The invisible girl was gone, and in her place was a woman who had built her own palace, not out of silk and lies, but out of truth and a love that never gave up.